there, it's Mrs. Miller. Today I'm going to talk to you about watercolors. So I've started off with some supplies before we get started. The first one is I have some watercolor paints. They usually come in a tube like this. Or you can actually buy cheaper packs of watercolors that come in like a palette like this. Either one is fine. This palette does have a tendency, though, to be a little bit more watered down. You can get a little bit more of saturation when you use tubed watercolors. The second materials that I have obviously are my brushes. And of course, I have my water. So I'm going to put my brushes into my water and put those aside. The next objects that I have that I'm working with materials are I've got a sponge. If you don't have a sponge at home, you can use paper towel. You could use like a dish sponge if you want as well. So I have a little sponge that we're going to be working with. I have rubbing alcohol. A higher percentage is better. And you can buy these with little spray bottles or just in a gigantic bottle like this. And I also have like a little dropper that I'm going to use as well to actually get that out. If you don't have a dropper, then you can use like a Q-tip or a paintbrush to apply your rubbing alcohol. So we're going to take a look at that as well. I'm also going to have some masking tape. I have some salt. The salt that I've used is a kosher salt. It has a little bit more of a texture to it than a table salt. You can use any type of salt that you want. And I also have some paper towel. And I've got a palette. So the palette that I'm using is a recycled meat tray. So whenever I buy meat or chicken from the grocery store, I will spray bleach and wash these and then dry them and then bleach them again a second time. And then that will give me a nice a palette that resists paint, which I really like. And I've got my watercolor from my tubes onto my palette. You'll notice that in comparison to my baby finger, we don't want to work with two big pieces of watercolor. You want to keep them squeezed onto your palette at a small size. So one of the first thing that I'm going to do is if you have large watercolor paper, you want to cut down your watercolor paper. This is about a little bit smaller than the size of an 8.5 by 11. So any size like that would be fine. And then the next thing you want to do is whatever surface you're working on, you want to actually tape your watercolor down with masking tape all along the edges. So just don't masking tape one little section. Tape the whole thing down because what that's going to do is it's going to stop your paper from buckling. The watercolor paper, the cheaper the watercolor paper, the thinner it is, and then the more it's going to buckle for you. So this gives us a good opportunity for our work not to buckle. What I like to do is I like to tape mine down on something that I can move. So then that way when I'm done working on it, then I can move it elsewhere and work in my space again with something else. So any type of masking tape works. The green is great, but if you don't, just don't use Scotch tape or like a packing tape. You really want to make sure that you are using some type of a masking tape. So once I've cut my paper down and I have taped it down, my next step is to start to do some labeling. So I've divided my page into 8 sections. I've left a little bit of a space so then that way I can label my work. So we're going to work on, I'm going to show you how to create layers with watercolor, how to do a gradient, how to lift, how to use masking, how to use salt, sponge, splatter, and then our rubbing alcohol. And these will give us some good techniques to help us move forward in a final composition. Okay, so let's get started with our very first painting, which is we're going to start with our layers. So I've got my water and I'm just going to pick a smaller brush. I'm going to start to work with, I think my brush is a size, I think it's a 6. So yeah, I'm going to work with a 6. So what I'm going to do is I've got my water. I'm going to place my water over here where you are not going to see it on camera. But basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a color. You can start with any color you want. I'm going to start with Prussian blue. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull off a little section of that paint. I'm going to zoom in on that for you so you can take a look at that and see it. I'm just going to put the light on it so we can see it. So what I want to do then is dip my water in my brush in my water, and I want to pull off a nice wet section. I don't want to use a really thick pigment. I really want to water this down. What's really nice about watercolors is you work with a light layer first, and then you can darken up over top. So that's a good start for me. And then I'm going to move into my layer section, and I'm going to grab my watercolor, and I'm going to run a really quick, fast layer. If this is thick and shiny, you're not doing it correctly. So what you want to do is I'm going to dip back into my brush, into my water, and I'm just going to control the paint with my brush and my water. The idea with watercolor is you want to work watery. You do not want your colors to be thick. That's not the effect we're looking for when we're working with watercolors. So you can see I'm not even applying any more paint to my water. And I'm just sort of filling this in really quick and fast. Okay. If you want to work with a slightly larger brush, that's fine. Sometimes you can fill in spaces a little bit bigger in order to do that. So what I'm going to do with my layers is I'm actually going to let that dry, and I'm going to go back and darken up my layers as I move forward into this demo. So I'm going back. So my next one is I'm going to do a gradient. So when I work on a gradient, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to grab my color. I'm going to pull it off. I'm going to stick with the same color. And when I create a gradient, I'm going to zoom in on this a little bit because I'm going to go back to layer after, is I'm going to start a gradient, a top to a bottom, dark to light. I'm going to run, I've used a little bit more pigment this time. You can see it's a little bit darker. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to work my way across that box shape just like that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply pure water. And you can notice I'm painting in more of like a circular kind of manner. And I'm going to add my water again. And I'm going to pool, and it's kind of like called bleeding. I'm going to bleed my water down. And this is giving me a really quick value change, which takes a little bit longer when we are working with paints and acrylic paints and pencil crayon. But with my watercolor paints, this moves really fast. So I have now a dark moving into a light value tone. I kind of did that over here a little bit as well. What I can do though is I can see that it's like just a little bit up here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back in, I'm going to grab a little bit more of my paint. And while this is still wet, you can see that as I start to pool that, it starts to bleed for me. If you're using too much water, a really simple thing you can do is you can get your paper, if it's bleeding all over the place because you've used a little bit too much water, you can take a piece of your paper towel and you watch what'll happen. I can just dab off my paint and it's going to do some lifting for me. Well, that just kind of stuck, didn't it? That was terrible. But you can see that lifted it a little bit. So I can do some dabbing here, which is what our sponge is going to kind of look like. But I can dab that off if I want to. I don't want to, though. I want to keep that fairly dark. So I'm going to go back in. I'm going to darken that up a little bit. And then what I can do then actually is I can bleed in another color if I want to. So if I want to bleed in a darker color or a lighter color, I can do that as well. So I've got some purple on my palette. And again, any color combination you want to use is fine. You don't have to be using the same colors as I am. And then what I can do is, while this is still wet, I can bleed this through a little bit. And you can see that, I'm hoping you can see that that's starting to darken a little bit. And then I can bleed that through a little bit more. Because I'd like to work a little bit bigger. So I've now grabbed a 10 brush. And I'm just going to sweep this down a little bit, and it's just going to take up my space a little bit more for me, a little bit quicker. So there we've got a nice gradient happening. You can tell already that the paper is starting to buckle. You can see it starting to buckle here as well. Okay, so which is fine. That's what watercolor paper does. Okay, so that's a great example of a gradient. My layer isn't dry yet. I'm going to go back to that when it's dry, and I'm going to swipe a couple of darker layer tones over top of that. This is a quick and fast and dirty and easy way to cover up your space fast. I'm going to move into lifting, and a lifting is where you're going to need to use your paper towel. And I might change my colors a little bit. I might move into, I'm going to move into a red. I think this is a crimson red that I've got. You can stay with your same color palette. I just want to make it a little bit more interesting. So when you are watercoloring, what you really want to do is make sure that you have areas that stay white. So I've got a strip of my red there. I've put my brush back in my water. I haven't gone back into my paint. And I'm just going to sort of bleed this out a little bit. Now, here's the thing. If my red butts up against the blue and they're both wet, it's going to create a bleed, right? So they're both going to bleed through. So I want to be really careful when I'm putting colors next to colors that I'm working with some dry time. So watercolors do take a little bit longer time because I don't want them to bleed into one another. You can see the bleed right here. This is what happened over here. Which is fine with its similar colors, but a red into a blue's, going to cause it to turn purple for me. So there's one. I want to create a negative space. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up some paint. I'm going to pull this down. And I just really want to fill this in a little bit on the darker side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use quite a bit of paint. You can see that this is quite a bit darker than my other side. And I'm going to fill this in nice and dark. Okay. If it is thick and it's not applying loosely to your paper, you're not using enough water. Okay, so here I've created a white space or a highlight, which is what I really want when I'm working with watercolors. But what you can see is, you know what, I really want this side to be lighter because I want it to match. What I can do is I can do what's called a lift. So while this is still wet, what I can do is I can wash off my brush, dry my brush off, and watch what'll happen. If this is still wet, I can pull and lift off a section, and that's going to create a highlight for me. So here's my brush, the paint's on it, wash it off, dry it off, and then I can pull and lift a highlight down my work. So you can see that picking up slightly there. I can switch my brush if I want to get a thinner one. While it's still wet, I'm drying off my brush. I'm squeezing it with my finger, and I'm lifting. So if my paint has dried, I can reapply my water, dry my brush off, and then I can re-lift this so I can get a bit of a highlight in there. Okay, so sometimes I have to press a little bit on the harder side. So this is a good example here of a lift. Sometimes the camera doesn't pick it up. So I can apply my water, dry my brush off, and this will lift off for me. Lift, lift, lift. And then that's a good way. If I'm making a mistake or something's too dark, then that'll help me with my painting. Okay, so that's okay. So what I'm going to do now with masking is have you take a look at liquid frisket. Liquid frisket is a material that you would use when you're using watercolor, and what it does is it creates a resist. So you can see that it's called Incredible White Mask, and Liquid Frisket is actually the shape. Is called a frisket that you would create when you use this product. There's a sticky consistency to it, and I actually painted it before this demo. And what I'm actually using also is masking tape. I've cut out little shapes of masking tape to help me create that frisket. So what I'm going to do then is the frisket is going to resist my paint. So I'm just going to mix a little bit of yellow here, and I'm just going to do a quick wash over top, and then the masking fluid will resist my paint, and so will the masking tape. Don't worry if you bleed over the lines a little bit. A nice and watery so that way it dries quickly is super helpful. I'm going to mix a little bit of vermilion as well. And the vermilion will give me a little bit of a gradient so I can continue to practice with my blending techniques. So as you can see, I'm just painting right over top of it, adding some water to help making it a watery consistency. And I'm just dabbing and blending the two colors together to create an interesting value tone. Okay, so we're going to move on to back to layers, and you can see that the layer is now dried, and I'm going to mix up some different values of blue to overlay over top of the original base color that I created under the layer section. If you bleed over, don't worry about it, just lift it up. And as I'm adding different types of water or different types of values, you can see I've added a little bit of white here. And then what I've done is overlap that so that way I can create a variety of different value tones and what would be known as low lights as well. Okay, so this is a great way when you're doing watercolors, you want to overlap. We're going to move on to salt. And with salt, and I've sped this video up a little bit, and with salt, we are going to add different types of watered down paint and adding little bits of salt. You can see it starts to bleed through. And when everything dries, you can blow it off, and then the salt will come off and create a texture for you. Next, under sponge, we're going to add a watered layer down. Keep practicing your gradient. Adding some yellow tones here and some greens. Use any colors you guys want. And adding some blues just to give it some value change. Using a sponge or a paper towel or saran wrap, you're going to dab, 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 and that's going to create a value change for you and give you some texture. This works really well for skies, water, anything like that. Okay, so next up, we are going to start looking at splatter. And with splatter, I'm going to mix some of this portrait tone. You can use any color you want. I'm going to water that down. And then what you're going to want to do is let that dry. And I'm going to put it with some paper towel over it just to dry it up a little bit so I can move a little bit faster. And again, I've sped this video up a little bit. And then taking whatever color you want and then tapping your paintbrush. You can flick it with your fingers. A toothbrush works as well. What you might want to do though is cover up the edges before you do this on your actual piece so then that way it's not going to splatter on other areas of your work. Moving on to rubbing alcohol, I'm going to mix up some red and then add some light layers of watered down red. I'm going to add some blues and a variety of different colors, whatever colors you want, that are going to sort of mingle and mix together. And then once I've done that, made sure I've got lots of water. I'm going to take my rubbing alcohol and I'm going to drop it onto my watercolor while everything is so wet. Notice that I've left some white spaces as well, and that helps with the alcohol as well, creating this like really cool and interesting design to my work. Remember, 91% or a higher percentage of alcohol always works well. So that's it. That's the watercolor technique demonstration. I hope you enjoyed it. Please remember, if you hear a voice within you say you cannot paint, then by all means paint, and that voice will be silenced. The great words of Vincent van Gogh. So take care, everybody, and keep making art.